Hi, lovelies. Welcome back to Nelly Miss Love Stories. Today's story is about a young black woman who survived a plane crash and that left so many scars on her body. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this story.
The bidding had reached 2.3 billion won. And Desire Taylor had no idea her name was on the auction board. She stood near the champagne table at the Joseon Palace Hotel in Seoul, South Korea, completely unaware, talking to a translator about a children's literacy program she'd flown in to support. She was 26 years old, from Nashville, Tennessee, and she had not come to this country to be noticed. But the thing about Desire Taylor was, she was always noticed. Not because she tried. Because she didn't. She wore a deep burgundy Roland Mouret off-shoulder gown that moved like it had been poured onto her. Her locks were pinned up with gold cuffs, a few escaping to frame her face, that face. Warm brown skin, heart-shaped jawline, cheekbones that made people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. She was, by any measure, stunning. But it was what came after the face that people always registered. Because below her collarbone, traveling down her left shoulder and disappearing beneath the fabric of her gown, was raised, silver-kissed scarring. The kind that told a story no one expected to see on a body that otherwise looked untouched. She had learned at 26 to wear it like armor. What she did not know, not yet, was that a mischievous publicist named Park Soo-yeon had listed an item in the silent auction program after 2 glasses of champagne. Private dinner conversation with celebrated American author Desire Taylor, exclusively for literary philanthropists. Desire had signed no such thing. The bidding was now at 2.8 billion won. She was still talking about children's books. And then the room shifted. Not loudly. Not with announcement. Just a quiet rearrangement like iron filings responding to a magnetic field that had just entered the building. She noticed it in the eyes first. People looking past her. Conversations halting mid-syllable. Women straightening their posture without realizing. She turned. He walked in 17 minutes late, which in Seoul's elite circles was either social suicide or a deliberate statement of power, and with Choi Min-ho, everything was deliberate. He was 29. The youngest CEO in South Korean chaebol history. 4 months ago he had assumed control of Choi Dynamics, a technology and urban development conglomerate worth 47 trillion won, and the business world had held its breath waiting for him to stumble. He had not stumbled. He was lean, composed, with the kind of quiet physical authority that didn't announce itself. His tuxedo was custom, dark navy with subtle silver threading that caught the light. His jaw was sharp. His hair was pushed back except for one deliberate piece that fell forward. When he smiled at the event host crossing to greet him, it was only with one corner of his mouth. Like smiling was a resource he rationed. Desire looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her champagne. She had zero interest in men who walked into rooms and waited for the room to bow. 2 minutes later, someone appeared at her elbow. Miss Taylor? Desire is fine. I'm Kim Jun, personal secretary to Chairman Choi Min-ho. A slight bow. The chairman has submitted the highest bid on tonight's literary dinner experience. He'd like to confirm your availability tomorrow evening at 8. Desire stared at him. What dinner experience? The argument with Park Soo-yeon lasted 11 minutes. It is for the children. Soo-yeon kept repeating, hands clasped together in theatrical supplication. The bid has reached 3.1 billion won. Desire. 3 billion won for your foundation. I came here to donate to a mentorship program. Not myself. It is just dinner. Desire looked across the ballroom. Choi Min-ho was now surrounded by 7 people, all of them angled toward him like sunflowers. He was nodding at something being said to him, performing attention politely. But his eyes, and this was the detail that made her pause, were restless. Drifting. Like a man profoundly bored inside a room that was supposed to impress him. And then, as if he felt the precise weight of her gaze from across a crowded ballroom, he looked directly at her. She didn't look away. She had learned at 16 never to look away first. For 3 full seconds they held each other across the noise and the crystal and the wealth. Then the half-smile. Slow. Deliberate. Like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. She looked away. One dinner, she told Soo-yeon. And you owe me for the rest of your natural life. She did not know that Choi Min-ho, sitting in the back of his car 20 minutes later, would instruct Kim Jun to find every word ever published by or about Desire Taylor before morning. She did not know that he would read her debut novel, all 340 pages of it, by 4 a.m., alone in his penthouse with the city spread out below him like a circuit board, and reach the final page with the rare and unsettling feeling of having been understood by someone he had never met. Before you understand what finding Min-ho meant, you need to understand who Desire was before him. She was born in Nashville, Tennessee, the only child of Dr. James Taylor, a university literature professor who believed words were the closest thing humans had to immortality, and Gloria Taylor, a former Broadway singer-turned-music therapist who hummed while she cooked and cried openly at good books. Desire grew up saturated in language and music and love so thick you could hold it. Words were currency in the Taylor house. Beautiful words. Precise words. Words that meant something. Her father read poetry at breakfast. Her mother sang jazz standards while doing laundry. And Desire sat between them, absorbing it all like soil absorbs rain, quietly, completely, permanently. She was, by 16, the most gifted young writer her high school had produced in 20 years. Which was why she was on that plane. A National Young Writers Symposium in Atlanta. She was flying back with her parents. Her father had surprised her by flying down to attend the award ceremony where Desire had placed first, when the aircraft hit a catastrophic storm system over eastern Tennessee. The investigation would later call it severe mechanical failure compounded by extreme weather conditions. Desire called it the night her world ended, and she was the only one who didn't get to go with it. She was seated 3 rows behind her parents. Seat 14C. Window. Left side. She woke up in a field. The left side of the fuselage had remained structurally intact on impact. Everything else had not. She was found at 2:17 a.m. by emergency responders, conscious and in shock, with burns across her left shoulder, scar tissue forming along her collarbone from a seatbelt engagement at catastrophic pressure, and damage running down the left side of her back. Her face, cruelly, completely, was untouched. Cruelly because an untouched face meant people could approach her without knowing. Could get close, find her beautiful, start a conversation, and then see. And the recoil was always the thing. Not cruelty. Just the instinctive human flinch at evidence of catastrophe on a body that otherwise looked like it had never suffered a single thing. She spent 3 months in hospital. 2 years in therapy. 4 years in silence, writing things she didn't show anyone. Her aunt, her father's younger sister Auntie Ruth, became her guardian. A fierce, warm woman from Memphis who wore big earrings and had opinions about everything and cried without shame. She was nothing like Desire's father in temperament and everything like him in substance. All love all the way down. Auntie Ruth held the family together. She held Desire together. By 20, Desire had written her first novel. By 23 she had published it, Burning Coordinates, a story about a girl who survived something unsurvivable and spent years trying to understand what the survival was for. It sold 400,000 copies in 18 months. It was translated into 11 languages including Korean. And it was a Korean literary foundation that invited her to Seoul at 26, which was how she ended up in a burgundy gown at a charity gala, champagne in hand, having her name auctioned off to a billionaire she hadn't planned on meeting. Life, as her mother used to sing, had a sense of humor. The restaurant had no name on the door. That told Desire everything she needed to know about the category of money she was dealing with tonight. It was on the 34th floor of a private Gangnam building, dark wood amber lighting, and an entire wall of glass looking out over the Han River glittering in the October night like the city had scattered its stars downward. She wore a cobalt blue Stella McCartney wrap dress. Her locks were down tonight, loose and voluminous, tipped with small gold threads. Her scars were visible at her shoulder and collarbone as always. She had stopped covering them at 23. Before that, 4 years of turtlenecks and shame. Minho stood when she entered. Not because protocol demanded it. She could tell the difference. He stood the way people stand when something matters. He was in dark charcoal, no tie, collar open one button, simultaneously more powerful and more human than the tuxedo version. He looked at her with the careful, focused attention of someone examining something rare. Not rude. Not consuming. Just precise. "You read my book," she said before he could speak. She hadn't planned to say it. But the copy of Burning Coordinates was sitting on the corner of the table. Spine worn. Pages marked. He paused. "Last night. All of it. I don't sleep much." He gestured to the seat across from him. "The chapter where Maya burns the letters, I read it twice." Desire sat down slowly. The chapter where Maya burns the letters was 12 pages, quiet and devastating. No reviewer had ever mentioned it. It was the most autobiographical thing she had ever written, and only someone reading carefully would understand why. "Why twice?" she asked. "The first time I read it as a reader," he said. "The second time I was trying to understand how you knew that grief isn't about the person you lost. It's about the version of yourself that existed when they were still alive." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "You have a literature degree hidden somewhere?" she asked. "Engineering. Architectural philosophy minor." The half smile again. "But my mother was a reader." Was past tense. She filed it away. The dinner lasted 4 hours. They talked about Seoul and Nashville. About the strange loneliness of being young and responsible for things larger than yourself. He talked about inheriting Choi dynamics not with triumph but with the specific terror of a man handed a glass sculpture in a crowd. She talked about finishing her second novel 6 months after the first one became famous, and the paralysis of trying to write something worthy of the people who trusted the first one. He listened the way engineers listen, for structure. 4 load-bearing points. For what was actually being said beneath the words. She noticed. By the 3rd hour, the conversation had moved somewhere quieter. Your scars, he said. Directly. No theatrical hesitation, no performance of sensitivity. Just, the thing that was in the room. I read about the crash. I hope that isn't. It's fine, she said. And then more honestly, it's actually fine. You're the first person tonight who mentioned it directly instead of staring at it and looking away. I noticed that at the gala. The way people looked and then immediately redirected. Something moved through his expression. I found it offensive on your behalf. She studied him. You don't have a filter. I have a very expensive one, he said. I chose not to use it with you. Why? He considered this with complete seriousness. Because I read 340 pages of your most honest thinking, he said, and responding with performance felt dishonest. Desire Taylor had been in love once. She'd been proposed to once. She had been looked at by men on 3 continents and she had never, not one time, felt so completely and immediately understood by someone who was functionally a stranger. She picked up her wine glass. Tell me about your mother, she said. And the night deepened around them like a held breath. Minho's story was different in texture but familiar in loneliness. He was the only son of the late Chairman Choi Byung-jun and the late Park Mi-rae. His father gone at 58 to a sudden stroke, his mother to a cancer so quiet it had nearly completed its work before anyone caught it. He was 25 when he buried his father. 26 when he buried his mother. 27 when Choi Dynamics Board, after a brutal internal war, placed the company in his hands. He had 2 aunts who had been waiting for 2 years to choose his wife. Aunt Choi Young-hee was his father's eldest sister, 71 years old, hanbok at every family occasion, cold strategic intelligence behind every pleasant sentence. She had already shortlisted 3 candidates, the daughter of a hotel dynasty, a Harvard-educated shipping heiress, a Korean-American girl whose family connections read like a government directory. Minho had taken each of them to dinner. Been perfectly gracious. Felt absolutely nothing. You're impossible, his cousin Haun told him. She was the good cousin, 24, studying fashion in Paris, home for the holidays. The one he actually liked. Either you have a specific idea of what love is supposed to feel like, or real people can't compete with your imagination. Maybe, he'd said. What does it feel like? In your imagination. He'd considered this for a long time. Like being understood without having to translate myself first. Haun had looked at him with the particular sadness of someone watching a man build his own cage and call it standards. That was 3 weeks before the gala. 3 weeks before Desire Taylor walked into his city. They had 3 weeks before her return flight to Nashville. Minho spent those 3 weeks with the focus of a man who had found something rare and had decided, without ceremony, to stop pretending otherwise. He took her to Buckshin Hanok Village on a Tuesday before the tourists arrived, when the alleys were misted and the traditional rooftops curved against a pale sky like something drawn by hand. She wore a camel-oversized coat, big gold hoops, her locks loose, and she moved through the village touching stone walls, pausing at doors, noticing everything. He watched her notice everything. You're watching me again, she said without turning. You notice things the way I notice structures, he said. Load-bearing points. What's holding what up? She turned to look at him. That's the most interesting compliment I've ever received. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. Even better, she said. He took her to Norwegian Fish Market at 5 a.m., her specific request after reading a travel essay. She ate raw octopus without hesitating while he filmed her reaction, a reflex he immediately found embarrassing. She made him show her the video, then laughed so hard at her own face that the vendor beside them started laughing too. They went to Jeju Island for a weekend. Walked the coastal all trails where volcanic rock met ocean in constant argument. She wore rust-orange linen and white sneakers and her locks in a high puff, and the wind off the ocean was aggressive and personal. Somewhere around kilometer 6, she slipped on wet rock. He caught her wrist before she'd finished falling. They stood like that, her wrist in his hand, the ocean making its case below them, the wind between them. Thank you, she said quietly. Are you hurt? No. He didn't let go for another breath. She didn't move to take it back. Then they kept walking. That night, on the Jeju Resort Terrace, she told him about the crash. Not the version she gave journalists. The real one. The sound. The cold and then the heat. waking up in a field with the smell of her own burning, the silence where her parents' voices had been, the particular horror of being found alive while the search teams were still looking for the others. He listened without interrupting, without rushing toward comfort, without doing that thing people always did, jumping ahead to fix it, to lighten it, to redirect. When she finished, the silence lasted a full minute. "You write about survival," he said finally, "because you're still trying to figure out what it was for." She looked at him. "Yes. I understand that differently," he said. "But I understand it." She believed him. She didn't know why so immediately, but she did. "I fly back in 10 days, she said. "I know. This has been," she stopped, choosing carefully, "unexpectedly important." "Yes," he said. Immediately. Like he'd been holding that agreement ready. She flew home to Nashville with his number 16 manuscript pages she'd written in her Seoul hotel room, and the persistent, disorienting feeling that she'd left something behind that she didn't have words for yet. They called every single day. Audio only at first, both of them independently deciding there was something more honest about a voice without the performance of a face. He called at 9 p.m. his time, which was 7 a.m. hers, while she was having her first coffee in her Nashville apartment in old sweats with a notebook open. She called at 11 p.m. her time, 1 p.m. his, when he would step onto his office terrace 40 floors up and talk to her while Seoul spread below him like a living map. He read everything she'd ever written. She read everything written about Choi Dynamics, which led to reading about urban architecture and sustainability, which led to her asking him questions that visibly caught him off guard. "You actually read the ESG annual report," he said one afternoon. "I read everything." "Why?" "Because you're interesting." She used his word. Deliberately. He was quiet a moment. Then, "My legal team would like to send you a non-disclosure agreement." She burst out laughing. "Excuse me?" That came out wrong. "What I meant," a pause which she recognized now as him catching himself, "is that I've been telling you things. I tell you things I don't tell people I've known for 10 years. I noticed it. And I thought you should know that I noticed it. And the NDA was your brain's response to that vulnerability? I process emotional exposure as a legal risk," he said. "It's a known issue." "Minho," she said. "That is the most revealing sentence you've ever spoken." "I'm aware," he said. "Which is the problem." 6 weeks after Seoul, the story broke. Korea Business Journal, Choi Minho linked to American author. Sources cite months of private contact. 2 photos. One from the gala. One somehow sourced from the Jeju Trail, her rust-orange linen visible at distance, his hand near her arm. Technically nothing. Contextually, everything. Within 12 hours, 14 million social media posts across South Korea. 2 trending hashtags. A fan forum dedicated to researching Desire Taylor, Tennessee. Her scars discovered and discussed in comment sections with a range of human responses from tender to cruel. And a phone call from Aunt Choi Young-hee that Minho had been dreading since the gala. The meeting took place in the formal sitting room of the Choi family estate in Yongsan. Minho walked in knowing exactly what it was. He went anyway because he had a fundamental inability to avoid things that needed confronting. Aunt Young-hee was seated. Aunt Young-ok stood near the window. Cousin Sang-won, the bad one, the board vote one, had been invited, which told Minho someone was already doing political arithmetic. "She's not Korean," Young-hee said. Surfaced pleasantly. "Correct," said Minho. "She's American. With no family connections in this country. No. She's a celebrated author whose work has been translated into 11 languages including Korean," he said. "Her intellectual and professional standing is not the question in this room. Her origin is. And I'd like to be honest about that." Silence. "The company, Young-ok started, is a technology conglomerate. Not a dynasty requiring marriage alliances." His voice was even. Completely controlled. "I have no legal, structural, or ethical obligation to marry within a geography. The optics of a foreign are irrelevant to shareholder returns," he said, "which are the only optics our legal charter requires me to consider." Young-hee set down her tea with the deliberateness of a woman reloading. "Minho, this family has a name. A standing. Your father spent 40 years. My mother," he said, and his voice changed just slightly the way temperature drops before rain, "spent her last 2 years hoping I would find someone who made me genuinely happy. Not strategically sound. Not socially suitable. Happy." He looked at his aunt steadily. "I'm going to honor that." He left. In the car outside, his hands were perfectly still. He had learned to keep his fury internal, a controlled burn, nothing escaping. He called Desire. "Tell me something good," he said when she picked up. She heard it immediately, the particular flatness underneath the words. My neighbor's cat knocked my entire bookshelf over at 3 in the morning. I found him sitting on top of a copy of Middlemarch looking personally victorious. Pause. Then the real laugh, sudden, unguarded, escaped. Tell me what happened, she said. Gently. And he did. 4 months later, the Seoul Literary Institute offered Desire a 3-month residency, developing an international mentorship program for young writers. It made professional sense on every level. She said yes before she finished reading the email. She arrived in March, when Seoul's cherry blossoms were beginning their brief, extravagant performance. Minho met her at Incheon Airport himself. No driver, no assistant, which Kim Jun later described as unprecedented in 4 years of service. He was in a dark green wool coat and he looked, the moment she cleared arrivals, like a man who had been managing a specific tension for months and was finally releasing it. She walked straight to him. You came yourself, she said. I have a valid driver's license. That's not what I know what you meant. The half-smile. Hello, Desire. Hello, Minho. He took her bag and they walked out into the sharp Seoul spring morning and she thought, this feels like returning. Which makes no sense. I've only been here once. The apartment he'd arranged was in Mapogu, her specific request, because she didn't want Gangnam with its polish and its observation. Mapo was creative and slightly rumpled, full of independent bookshops and small cafes and art students with paint on their coats. It was perfect. It was so precisely her that she stood in the living room doorway and turned to look at him. You remembered everything I said I liked. I remember everything you say. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and hugged him. Not romantically, not yet. That would come. But with the full, unguarded weight of genuine feeling, her chin on his shoulder, and he brought his arms around her like it was something he'd been practicing in his mind for months. I'm glad you're here, he said very quietly. Me too, she said. Into his shoulder. Me too. The next 8 months built something that neither of them had a clean name for. They fought. Properly. Real fights. Once, when he solved 3 of her problems before she'd asked him to solve any of them, rearranging her book tour schedule without telling her because he'd identified a conflict, and presenting it as a done thing. She was furious in the specific way of someone whose autonomy had been managed without consent. I'm not a logistics problem, she told him. I'm a person. I know that. Do you? Because you just reorganized 3 weeks of my professional life from your phone in 20 minutes without asking me a single question. He was quiet. Then, you're right. I treated the problem and forgot to talk to the person inside it. Yes. I'm sorry. She believed him because he looked genuinely troubled, not by being caught but by having done it. Once, she went 4 days barely responding to his messages during a dark writing period, and when he finally asked directly what was happening she said, nothing 3 times before admitting she went silent when she was overwhelmed because asking for help felt like weakness she hadn't fully unlearned yet. You can be overwhelmed with me, he said. That's what I'm here for. You're here to be my boyfriend, not my therapist. I'm here, he said with the patience of mountains, because I want to be wherever you are, including the difficult parts. She cried a little at that. She would never confirm this. They had a quiet 3-day cold after the second fight that frightened them both into more honesty than they'd managed before it. And then the ant situation escalated. Young-hee gave 2 separate interviews to entertainment media, careful, surface pleasant, devastating in subtext, implying Minho was being steered away from his heritage by an outsider influence. Neither interview named Desire. Both interviews were clearly about her. Desire read them on a Tuesday morning in her Mapo apartment over coffee. She sat with it for a while. Then she called Auntie Ruth in Memphis. Baby, Auntie Ruth said after listening carefully, that woman is scared. Scared people build walls and call them standards. You know how to handle scared people. How? You don't attack the wall. You just keep being undeniable until the wall becomes embarrassing to maintain. Desire sat with that. Then, Auntie Ruth, you are dangerously wise. I know it, baby. Now go be great. Haun arrived back from Paris for Chuseok wearing a burnt orange structured coat that made Desire immediately want to know her. Minho introduced them with the barely concealed nervousness of a man who needed 2 important people to like each other. They liked each other within 9 minutes. He excused himself from the table 20 minutes into their dinner and they didn't notice for 45. He's different with you, Haun said over their 3rd round of soju, in the honest way that alcohol and immediate friendship enabled. Not softer, realer. Like he stopped performing competence and just became a person. He was always a person, Desire said. To you, Haun said. To everyone else he's a chairman first and a human being somewhere lower on the list. She pointed with her chopsticks. You reversed that order. Do you understand how rare that is? I just talk to him like he's someone I like. Yes, Hone said. That's the miracle. That's the whole thing. She finished her soju. My aunt is going to come around, she said. Not easily. Not quickly. But she will. Because Young-hee respects one thing above everything else. What? People who know exactly what they're worth. Desire thought about this. Good. Because I do. Hone pointed at her again. I decided I love you about 30 minutes ago. This confirms it. It happened in November. Not at a rooftop with city lights. Not at the Han River at sunset. Not in a restaurant with a Michelin star. On the floor of her Mapo apartment. She'd been writing all day. He'd come over after a board meeting still in his suit, jacket off, sleeves rolled, tie gone. She'd ordered tteokbokki. Her manuscript pages were covering every flat surface in the apartment because she'd run out of table. They were eating out of takeout containers on the floor and he was reading a chapter she'd handed him, an early draft of her 4th novel, while she watched his face the way she watched everyone's face when they read her work. He finished. Set the pages down. This is the best thing you've written, he said. I know. It terrified me when I realized. He nodded, still looking at the pages. A long silence. Then he looked at her. I bought a ring 4 months ago, he said. She went completely still. I've been constructing the right moment for 3 months, he continued. The restaurant. The view. The perfect sentence. He looked around her apartment. The manuscript chaos, the takeout containers, her feet in thick knitted socks, the lamp making everything golden. This is the right moment. There's no performance here. This is just us. He reached into his suit pocket. The ring was emerald cut, set in warm gold. Simple. Extraordinary. He held it on his palm, not in a box. Open. Like a direct question. I don't want a strategic partnership, he said. I don't want suitable. I want someone who makes me think and makes me laugh and makes me better at being a person. I want you, Desire. I want you to make this country home. I want to come to Tennessee and sit at your auntie's table, Min-ho, and meet every person who, Min-ho, built you into. Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said again. Quieter. Completely certain. He slid the ring on her finger. His hands weren't perfectly steady. She noticed. She loved him more for it in that exact moment than she had in all the previous moments combined. She kissed him, and she would remember later that it was the first time she kissed him knowing she was kissing her future husband. And the manuscript pages rustled in the disruption, and the tteokbokki went cold, and the lamp kept its honey-colored witness over 2 people who had each learned, separately and painfully, to need no one, and had chosen, after everything, to need each other. She called Auntie Ruth that night. Auntie Ruth screamed so loudly that Min-ho, in the next room, looked up from his phone with genuine concern. Is he fine? Auntie Ruth was saying. Desire, baby, please tell me he is fine. Auntie Ruth. I need to know what I'm working with at this wedding. Auntie Ruth. Min-ho appeared in the doorway. Desire held the phone toward him with the expression of a woman surrendering gracefully. He took it. Hello, ma'am. I'm Min-ho. A pause while Auntie Ruth said something. Then the real laugh, helpless, full. Yes, ma'am. I'll take care of her. You have my word. Min-ho flew to Tennessee 3 weeks after the engagement. Auntie Ruth had been preparing since the phone call. The house in Memphis was warm and loud and smelled of sweet potato pie and the specific old book scent that permeated all homes where literature was a way of life. Min-ho moved through it with genuine attention, not the performance of charm but the real thing. Asking Auntie Ruth about the family photographs covering one entire wall. Sitting at the kitchen table while she talked, listening with the full focus that Desire had first noticed at the gala. At one point Auntie Ruth said, gesturing at a framed photo of Desire at 12, before the crash, beaming at a school spelling bee trophy, she has always been the smartest person in every room she entered, even when she was too young to know it. I know, Min-ho said simply. Auntie Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, you'll do. Which, Desire explained to him later in the car, was the highest possible praise in Auntie Ruth's vocabulary. He also met Desire's childhood best friend Camille, who interrogated him for 40 minutes while ostensibly helping him navigate a Memphis food tour. He passed. He also met Pastor Green from the family church, who told him Tennessee expected a man to look a woman's family in the eye, and Min-ho held the eye contact without blinking. You know, Camille told Desire afterward, I had a whole speech prepared. About protecting you. About what would happen if he hurt you. What happened to the speech? He happened to it. Camille shook her head. He actually sees you, Desire. Like he sees the whole thing. The scars, the grief, the brilliance, the difficult parts. He's not managing you. He's just there. Fully there. Yes, said Desire. Quietly. That's the thing. Back in Seoul, the formal Choi family dinner. Desire wore a Korean designer gown. Minho had suggested the name. She'd chosen the specific piece, red with gold embroidery at the cuffs, and her locks in an elegant updo. Her scars were visible on her shoulder as always. Yoonghee registered this in the first 3 seconds. Desire watched her register it, held the older woman's gaze with warmth and zero apology. The dinner moved carefully through its courses. Pleasantries. Precision. And then, midway through the second course, Yoonghee said, with the pleasantness of a well-sharpened instrument, "Your writing draws extensively from personal trauma. It must be cathartic." "From experience," Desire said gently but clearly. "I think of them differently. Trauma is what happens to you. What I write about is what you choose to do with it after." Yoonghee tilted her head a fraction. "My mother," Desire continued, and her voice stayed warm, "taught literature for 20 years. She used to say the best stories aren't about what breaks people. They're about what people build in the space that breaking leaves behind." She looked around the table, at the aunts, at Haun who looked delighted, at Minho who was watching her with the focused expression he wore when something was moving him that he hadn't prepared for. "I think that's true of families too." A silence. Aunt Young-ok said quietly, "Your mother sounds remarkable." "She was extraordinary," Desire said. And then genuinely, "I'd love for you to know her through her work sometime. I'll have copies sent." It wasn't a defeat of Yoonghee. Not tonight. But something shifted, the specific shift that happens when a calculated woman encounters someone she cannot find the gap in. Because Yoonghee had been looking from the moment Desire walked in for the weakness, the insecurity, the place to press. She hadn't found it. And Desire hadn't even been trying to hide it. She was simply, complete, unhideable. Haun caught Desire's eye across the table and raised her wine glass 1 millimeter. They married in April. Cherry blossom season. The timing had the inevitability of things that were always going to happen this way. The morning ceremony was a traditional Korean piebeek. In the Choi Estate garden, pink blossoms falling intermittently like the sky was participating. Desire wore a jakduri crown and wonsam robe in crimson and gold that Haun had spent 3 weeks helping her select. When Minho saw her emerge, he went still for 4 full seconds in a way that made Haun put her hand over her mouth and Kim Jun develop a sudden interest in his shoes. The evening ceremony was at a venue overlooking the Han River. Desire in a custom Vera Wang, off-shoulder, cathedral veil, Minho in white tie. The cherry trees around the venue dropping blossoms on their guests like a blessing that hadn't been planned. Auntie Ruth wore a royal purple suit that she had purchased specifically to be visible in photographs. She cried from the first note of music. Haun's maid of honor speech had the room cycling between laughter and tears with the skill of a master conductor. At one point she said, "Minho has always been the most capable person in every room. Desire is the first person who made him forget to be capable and just be himself." As someone who has watched him be relentlessly capable for 24 years, on behalf of the whole family, thank you. Aunt Yoonghee sat next to Auntie Ruth at the reception. By all accounts they talked for 2 hours. What they talked about no one knew. But at the end of the night Auntie Ruth said to Desire, "That woman loves that boy the way I love you. Scared and fierce and imperfect. She'll come around, baby. Give her time." An Minho at the end of the night at the terrace edge, city below, leaned his forehead against Desire's and said nothing. She let him. She understood. 7 months later, on a Sunday morning in their home in Songbuk-dong, Desire stood in the bathroom with a pregnancy test and looked at 2 lines. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub. She had expected joy. The joy was there, enormous, flooding, real. But underneath it, steady and cold as groundwater, was the fear. The old, familiar, crash survivor fear. What if I am not supposed to have this much? What if the universe, which once tore an aircraft apart around me, decides this too is more than I'm allowed? She sat with it for 10 minutes. Then she walked into the bedroom where Minho was reading the Sunday paper with his reading glasses on, a detail she found so endearing it was almost painful, and she held up the test. He looked at it, then at her. Then he set the paper down very slowly, like it was made of something fragile. "Are you?" "Yes." "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she said. "And the happiest I have ever been." Simultaneously. He was across the room in one motion and his arms were around her and she pressed her face into his shoulder and he held her in the specific way that said, "I have you. Nothing is going to happen. I have you." She let herself be held. She called Auntie Ruth, who cried immediately and then said, "I'm coming to Seoul. Don't try to stop me." "I wasn't going to." "Good." Haun found out via a phone call at 7 a.m. Paris time and screamed into the phone loud enough that Minho heard it from the next room. Yoonghee received a formal note. She responded within an hour, "Congratulations. I hope the child has your tenacity and his grandfather's mind." Desire, read this 3 times. She said your tenacity, she told Minho. Not the family's. Mine. He looked at the message. That, he said carefully, is enormous progress. The first trimester was hard. Desire was exhausted in ways that defied vocabulary, bone deep behind the eyes, makes you question the nature of consciousness. Tired. She wrote anyway. The first draft of her 4th novel emerged from this period with a rawness that she later decided no amount of comfortable circumstances could have produced. Minho became, during pregnancy, specifically and almost alarmingly attentive. He researched obstetric care with the same rigor he applied to corporate acquisitions. He learned medical terminology at 3 a.m. because she was sick and he needed to understand what was happening to her body. He removed, on 4 separate occasions, foods whose smells had become her enemies. He attended every appointment and asked questions her obstetrician said were unusually well-informed for a partner. You studied for this? Desire said after the 2nd appointment. Yes, he said without embarrassment. She kissed him in the hospital corridor. A nurse walked past and pretended not to see. The scar tissue along her torso and lower back, less elastic than normal skin, became uncomfortable as her belly grew. There were nights of real discomfort. She found positions that helped. Minho found a specialist in Seoul who worked with burn survivors during pregnancy and had learned exactly what helped and what didn't. He made the appointment before telling her about it, and then immediately caught himself and said, I made an appointment. Would you like to go? She laughed. You're learning. I'm trying. I know. That's why I love you. At month 5, a routine scan flagged a concern. A possible issue with umbilical cord position. The 10 days between that scan and the follow-up were the longest of her life. She didn't fully show it to anyone. By day she was functional, writing, answering emails, meeting her editor over video call. By night she sat up after Minho fell asleep and let herself feel the full weight of it. The fear. The old crash fear shape-shifting into this new form. I survived. I have survived everything. Please let this be something I get to keep. On the 3rd night she became aware that Minho was not asleep. He said nothing. He took her hand in the dark and held it. They sat like that for 20 minutes. I'm scared, she finally said. I know. Not just about the scan. I know that too. I feel like I'm waiting for it to be taken. A long silence. Then, the scan will be fine. Not frantic reassurance. Quiet, deliberate, needing it to be true as much as she did. And the fear, I think that fear is part of you. The part that knows what things cost. The part that doesn't take anything for granted. That part of you is not a flaw, Desire. It's why everything you build is so real. She leaned against him. When did you learn to say exactly the right thing? She asked. I read 340 pages of your most honest thinking, he said. I had an excellent teacher. The follow-up scan was perfect. Better than perfect. And the technician moved the wand and said with a smile, healthy boy. Desire looked at the screen. Minho's hand tightened around hers until she could feel his pulse in his grip. Boy. The fear didn't disappear. It never fully does for people who have learned that catastrophe is real. But it made room. Reorganized itself. Left space for something larger and louder and more insistent. Well, the specific, irreversible love that had already begun. He was born on a Thursday at 6:47 in the morning. Auntie Ruth had arrived from Memphis 10 days earlier and had been spectacularly helpful, cooking what Desire craved, reading aloud when Desire's back hurt, refereeing gently between Desire's desire for independence and Minho's desire to control every environmental variable. When the hospital called at 2 a.m., Auntie Ruth handed Minho his jacket from the chair without being asked. Go, she said simply. We're right behind you. The birth was long. Harder than the book said. And Desire was, through all of it, extraordinary. Minho would tell this story for the rest of his life. How at hour 11, when exhaustion had settled into her bones, she looked at him and said, Talk to me. About anything. Just keep talking. And so he talked. About their first dinner. About Bakshin in the mist. About Jeju and the wrist in the ocean. About the lamplight on her apartment floor and the manuscript pages everywhere and the night she said yes. He talked until her breathing changed and the room changed and the sound came. The sound of a new person arriving in the world for the first time. The doctors placed the baby on her chest. She made a sound that had no word in any language she'd ever read. Minho memorized it anyway. Would carry it for the rest of his life. She held the baby and looked at Minho and her eyes were full and her locks were wrecked and she had never, in all the time he had known her, looked more entirely herself. Hello, she said softly to the baby. We have been waiting so long for you. He weighed 3.4 kilograms. Full head of dark hair. Desire's mouth and Minho's brow and a look of composed, dignified indignation at his new circumstances that was so specifically Choi that Haun, seeing him 20 minutes later, said, "Oh, that's Minho's face. That is absolutely Minho's face." They named him Seojun James. Seojun, meaning talented future. James for a man from Nashville who had read poetry at breakfast and raised a daughter who survived everything and then, on top of surviving, built a life worth living. In the waiting room, Auntie Ruth and Aunt Choi Young, he had been sitting 4 chairs apart for 6 hours. When the nurse came out, mother and son healthy, all well, Young he closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them, turned to Auntie Ruth and said in careful English, "Your niece is remarkable." Auntie Ruth looked at her. Decided something. "I know," she said warmly. "I helped make her that way." And then, because Auntie Ruth had the instincts of a woman who understood that walls came down incrementally, she reached over and briefly covered Young he's hand with her own. Young he didn't pull away. Minho found the answer on an ordinary evening. Seojun was 4 months old. The apartment in Songbukdong was warm and slightly chaotic in the way of homes where a new person has moved in and rearranged the architecture of everything. Desire was in the window nook. The city light came in gold behind her. She was nursing the baby and reading with one free hand, her locks loose, the scarred curve of her shoulder visible in the lamplight, silver and raised and completely unhidden as always. She was wearing old sweats. She was completely unaware of being watched. Minho stood in the doorway. He thought about seat 14C. About a 16-year-old girl who woke up in a field with the silence where her parents had been, and who had spent 12 years trying to understand what surviving was for. Who had written 4 novels trying to answer it. Who had flown to a country she barely knew and walked into a ballroom in a burgundy gown and looked directly at him when he smiled his rationed half-smile, and had not looked away. He understood, standing in the doorway, that this was the answer. Not a grand revelation. Not the architecture of surviving. Just this. The ordinary, irreplaceable daily aliveness that followed the surviving. The capacity to be here. Unhidden. In a room. In a life. With people who saw everything and wrapped their arms around all of it. She looked up. Caught him. "You're doing the doorway thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The doorway thing. Where you stand there looking at me like I'm something that requires geological study." He walked over. Sat beside her in the window nook. The city continued below them. The baby made a small, satisfied sound. "I was thinking," he said. "About?" He looked at her, the face, the scars, the locks, the book open in her free hand, this woman who had decided, with the specific courage of someone who had already survived the unsurvivable, not to be afraid of him. "About how grateful I am," he said quietly, "that you were in seat 14C. Desire Taylor, Choi on paper, Taylor in print because those 4 books had earned it," looked at her husband for a long moment. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder. The baby slept. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, gorgeous and relentless and full of stories still becoming themselves. And inside the window nook, 2 people who had both learned the hard way that the world could split open without warning held each other in the ordinary, extraordinary, completely irreplaceable light.
Thank you for watching this video from the beginning to the end. Hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. See you in my next video.